Let's now consider question 3.5. Modern day whales are aquatic mammals. Remember that whales are not fish. They are aquatic, they live in the water, and they're mammals. They spend their entire lives in the ocean, so they don't come out of the ocean at all. Their entire life is spent in the ocean. They are, we're referring to modern day whales, are thought to have evolved from four-legged ancestors as represented below. So we have a very nice table here that shows us a column with the species and a little diagram. Existence on Earth, how long ago we find these species, and the characteristics. And we see that Pakicetus looked something like that, and we know it looked something like that because of the fossil evidence. Quite significant legs, and it existed about 50 million years ago, and it was a quadrupedal, that means 4 legs, carnivore. It's going to eat other animal matter. Ambulocetus, look at those legs. We've got them much shorter. We've got a much longer area of projection in the nasal and mouth region. 58 million years ago. So we've had a lot of time to change. And here we've got flipper-like feet. They're not little clawed feet. They are large feet. Goodness, look at those large feet. And they are flipper-like, and a tail for swimming. All right, our earlier ones also had a tail. And along comes Dorudon, and Dorudon is now 40 million years ago. So we're getting closer and closer to the present day. Dorudon hasn't got any legs, only these tiny little flippers. Look at the support for that tail. The tail is really well developed for swimming, and it also has a fairly large jaw. Large flippers in the front, very small flippers at the back, hind limbs. And finally, we come down to the present day Balaena, which is the blue whale, non-functioning pelvis. There it is. It's hanging around the vertebral column. It's not connected to a flipper. It's not connected to a leg, but large flippers in the front. Now, the first question says, which ancestor of whales most likely lived both in the water and on land? If we go back here, we can see that Ambulocetus had flippers, and flippers speaks to water, but it's also got the 4 limbs, which speaks to land. Pakicetus doesn't have flippers, it's only got legs. Whereas Dorudon has got tiny little hind limbs, but large flippers. Would it be able to walk on flippers? Probably not. So our both water and on land, we are coming back to Ambulocetus. And the ambulo part of the name also helps us understand it was ambulatory. It walked. Give one reason for your answer. We would have to talk about the presence of flippers and legs that enabled it to swim as well as walk on land. 2 things. You only needed to give one reason, but in saying flippers for swimming, legs for walking, there is the reason. Explain why Ambulocetus and Dorudon may be considered transitional species in the evolution of whales. When we talk about a transitional species, we're talking about a species that shows evidence of characteristics of the ancestors, like for example that tail, as well as evidence of characteristics in the descendants. So here we've got the ancestors, here we've got the descendants, and Ambulocetus and Dorudon has characteristics from the ancestors as well as characteristics from the descendants. And so that means that we're looking at transitional species. And remember that transitional species means a species that is showing evidence of change. And how is it going to show change? It's going to have both ancestral as well as descendant characteristics, or its traits. Some of them are going to be ancestral, and some we can look at the descendants and we can see the descendants have those traits as well, but more well developed. Explain, according to Lamarck, why modern-day whales do not have legs. Now remember, Lamarck was the very first scientist to put forward an explanation for how evolution happened. But we know that Lamarck's explanation is not supported by our modern understanding of how genetics works. So it's interesting to study the wrong ideas of Lamarck in order to see how science has changed over time. What would Lamarck have said why modern day whales don't have legs? Remember, Lamarck had the theory of use and disuse. And in his theory of use and disuse, he said if you use a characteristic, it grows or it develops. If you don't use the characteristic, it shrinks. Or if you don't use that feature of the body, it shrinks. And it might even become vestigial. So Lamarck would have said, let's get our picture up here, these ancestors of whales, modern day whales, used their flippers and used their tails. And so the flippers and the tails, the front flippers and the tails, developed and became larger and much more functional. Whereas the pelvic girdle and hind legs was not used, and so it became smaller and smaller and smaller until at the moment we would say that the pelvic girdle is vestigial. So you would need not only in this answer to explain the theory of use and disuse, but also relate the theory of disuse and use to modern whales and the lack of legs. So don't just say Lamarck had the theory of use and disuse. You'll get 1 mark for that, definitely 1 mark. But in order to get all 3 marks, you have to talk about how the flippers were used and became larger, much more functional, whereas the hind legs became smaller and smaller, dysfunctional, or what we call vestigial.